I have described the philosophical shift that I have been promoting for a couple of years as moving our culture closer to a guardian mentality rather than a warrior mentality. I believe the warrior mentality was a result of a political movement that started in the 60s when we declared war on crime, war on drugs, war on all sorts of things. The police agencies across this nation responded as they do to their political leadership in their communities. What I'm trying to do is help our new police officers find the right balance, because officers absolutely must have keen warrior skills and they must be able to use them without hesitation or policy. But I want them to consider their role within our democracy, and that role needs to be the role of a protector with the goal of protecting people rather than conquering them. When you try to initiate this type of a mindset shift, there is naturally going to be resistance. The greatest resistance I've encountered is just the misunderstanding of what I'm talking about. When I have the opportunity to explain it in more depth, most officers will say to me, "That's how good cops have always done it." I want our recruits on their first day on the street to have the wisdom of a good cop with 20 years experience.
Ms. Rahr, you have used a new approach of policing called LEAD, Listen and Explain with Equity and Dignity, which puts a premium on conversation and listening during a police encounter. Could you walk us through a hypothetical situation where LEAD has worked to de-escalate a situation and tell us why it works?
The purpose of developing the LEAD model was to simplify the principles behind procedural justice and give officers very specific, tangible behavioral direction. In situations where there's conflict, taking the time if there is not a threat present. I want to be very clear about that. If somebody's pointing a gun at you, you don't listen and explain. You do what you have to do. But in most police interactions in the community, there is time. And if officers are reminded of the benefit of listening, that will help set that interaction going down the correct track. Most police officers, like myself, we like to step in and control things, and we have to be reminded to stop and listen. When people say police should treat people with respect, the most effective way to convey respect is to listen. So we really want to emphasize that for our officers. The other area where many officers forget is that we know the system inside out. We know how the process is going to work. We know what's going to happen next. People that we're interacting with don't know that. And it's that lack of knowledge that creates another level of conflict. And again, if the officer is reminded, tell the person what they can expect, they will be more likely to cooperate. When we talk about equity, that is simply to underscore, make sure that you are recognizing whatever biases you bring to the table, make sure that you're making your decision on the outcome in an equitable way, and always leave with the person you're interacting with their dignity intact, and act with dignity yourself. A lot of officers will mock whenever we use an acronym, and I get that, but it's also a very effective way to teach very specific behavior.
In fact, talking about dignity, studies have shown that people in a community care more about how they are treated by police rather than the actual outcome of a police encounter. Police that may pull people over for a driving offense may find that people care more about whether they were treated fairly by a police officer than whether they actually got the ticket. But as you've acknowledged in the past, empathy and patience do not necessarily come naturally for some police recruits. And something as simple as officers having friendly, non-enforcement related conversations with community members have shown to have huge benefits in building community trust. How do we change things so that the system values these characteristics in our police?
I think we start in the training academy by modeling that type of behavior and being very clear about that as an expectation. We also need to clarify that empathy is not the same as sympathy. Empathy means you understand what the person in the other side of the interaction is experiencing. I think it starts with training. I think it was mentioned by another witness that we have to come up with appropriate measures. People will rise to those things that are measured, and when we find ways to measure officers behaving in ways that convey respect and dignity, that behavior will increase.
Mr. Burge, thank you for acknowledging the role that implicit bias might play in making the type of quick decisions police encounter every day. Social science research has shown that even individuals who believe that everybody should be treated equally may be affected by implicit biases or subconscious associations between people of color and a perception of aggression and crime. Can you give us an example of a situation in which an officer's perception about an individual might influence the way they react to that individual, and how could police departments work to preemptively dismantle this implicit bias?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the prototypical examples is one that Sheriff Clark mentioned earlier, sort of the self-initiated stop, maybe a broken taillight and that kind of thing. And not maybe even necessarily the initiation of the stop, but sort of how that interaction proceeds in that critical first few seconds. That it may be informed much more about, I think, with any of us, sort of broad categories that we're placing a new person who we've never met with or interacted with before, sort of into generalized buckets. And if officers don't do as training in several jurisdictions is starting to offer them instruction on, slow down the situation where possible, and sort of try to use very intentional decision-making strategies, I think they risk, especially because they often have to make these split-second decisions, being in some instances overly swayed by these subconscious sort of factors that they may not even be aware of, and if they were aware of, they would want to make sure we're not going into their decision making.
Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being with us today. In particular, our former King County Sheriff from Washington State, Ms. Rahr, for being here with us. And I actually had a question for you. I know that you've made many changes since you've been at the Criminal Justice Training Commission, and you talked a lot about transitioning away from a boot camp or military style approach to training officers towards a process that emphasizes the role as police as part of our communities, as guardians and protectors rather than military warriors. And I know after a long career as an officer yourself, when you got to the CJTC, you replaced the trophy case with the U.S. Constitution and put in place training procedures that include recruits being sprayed with pepper spray so they know what it feels like, instituting psychology classes so trainees can better understand what the people they work with can better understand the people they'll eventually be working with and protecting and interacting with. And I know your methods have not been without skeptics, and so I wondered if you could share with us why you think a new approach to training our young men and women to serve as police officers is needed, especially today, and how these training methods translate to different outcomes or interactions in practice.
Well, thank you for the question. I want to clarify that I don't condemn the training practices in the past. I think we've learned a lot through research and science about how to prepare officers to be more effective. So that's been one of the biggest areas of resistance, is people being offended that somehow by improving our training that we are criticizing what used to be, and that's not the case. We've learned more. In terms of pepper spraying the recruits, many people have misinterpreted that as an attempt to get them to feel empathy. Actually, the reason we do that is we want to put them in a fight for their life stress situation so that they can learn for themselves, that they can overcome extreme pain, extreme fear, and still carry on. When I talk about a guardian mindset, I have to continually reemphasize this is not a kinder, gentler way of doing the job. It's just the opposite. We've actually increased our firearms training. We've increased our defensive tactics training because we want to create strong, effective police officers who have the confidence that they don't have to behave in an intimidating manner. When someone has confidence, that actually tends to de-escalate as well. I think that when we were too focused on the boot camp method of training, it detracted away from our ability to train officers to be critical thinkers. When they were so worried about simply getting the right answer, memorizing checklists, it took away from those critical thinking skills. So what we've tried to shift toward is more of an officer training, the military officers type training, where you really focus on critical thinking and confidence.